Welcome back, everyone, as we dive back into the Great War, World War I. Well, with my next series of videos from France, beginning tomorrow with my visit to the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, which is the largest American cemetery in any part of Europe. I thought it would be a good time to start talking about the American involvement in the war. So we're going to be visiting our friends at the Great War channel. My friend Indy Nidell, who I know is a subscriber to this channel. We're going to take a look at the Meuse-Argonne offensive today. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest and also the deadliest offensive in all of American military history. So most, I would say let's say about half of all the battle deaths that occurred during the Great War on the American side took place in a couple of weeks during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Some of the most famous stories of the war are going to come out of that offensive. Some of the places that I visited are associated with that offensive. So we're going to dive into that today. As always, I've put the link in the description to the original content. The best channel on YouTube for information and learning about the Great War is the Great War channel. So definitely check them out if you have any interest in World War I. Let's go ahead and dive in.
This week is a remarkable week of the war, for this week sees the defenses of not one, but two of the Central Powers completely collapse.
And I should mention, if you're not familiar with the Great War channel, they do, in addition to a lot of special episodes where they actually visit places and they talk about certain aspects of the war, they also did a week-by-week talk about the war. And so we're in week 218 on this video. So there's going to be some talk about some things besides Meuse-Argonne, but that's mainly what I want to focus on.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the oil city of Baku fell to the Ottomans, but things went far worse for them on the Palestine front. After cutting off Ottoman communications, the British broke through their lines between Rafat and the Mediterranean Sea.
So I want to take a moment before we get any further, since we've got the map up, and just talk about what has led to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So the spring of 1918, you have what's known as the Kaiserschlacht offensive, and we're going to talk about that in some of my future videos when I visited places like Belleau Wood and the German cemetery near Belleau Wood. The Kaiserschlacht offensive is this major offensive in the spring of 1918 that was intended to try and bring an end to the war before the Americans can get there in strength. So by 1918, Russia's out of the war. The Germans have pushed back in that direction, and they've negotiated a settlement that brings an end to the war. So now they're able to bring something like 50 divisions from the east over to the Western Front. Now, these divisions are not full strength anymore. A lot of them are depleted. A lot of them have very young, raw recruit conscripts filling their ranks. So they're not the forces that Germany had in 1914. But that's a whole lot of men. So the idea is overwhelm the Allied lines before the United States gets into the war. And the United States has something like 10,000 new soldiers arriving on the front every single day. They joined the war in April of 1917, but they're really not into the fight in a significant way until the summer of 1918. So the Kaiserschlacht was really four offensives altogether. One of them was called Michael, and that was one of the main ones. And it was kind of on the right flank of the German line, up near Belgium, northern France. And they actually do push the Allied lines back. They make some of the most significant advances that they've made since 1914. And it's once again on the Marne River where they're going to be stopped. They're going to be stopped something like 50, 60 miles from Paris. And the tide kind of turns around June, places like Belleau Wood. And that's where the Marines will famously make their stand for the U.S. and really see combat in a major way for the first time in the Great War. So by September of 1918 now, the Germans have run out of steam. They've depleted their manpower. Their divisions are something like a quarter, a third strength in many places. And now the Americans are there in big numbers, and now they can launch a counterattack. It comes at Saint-Mihiel and then at Meuse-Argonne.
and closed in on Nazareth. On the Macedonian front, a couple of Allied attacks and a mutiny among the Bulgarians led to a sudden Allied breakthrough there. So sudden, the Allies didn't even realize it. There was also a smaller Allied breakthrough on the Western Front. Attacks on the Western Front continued. In fact, there were two new Allied offensives there this week. One was a huge Franco-American attack from Champagne to the Meuse River. The preliminary bombardment contained mustard and phosgene gas shells and incapacitated 10,000 Germans.
And you've heard me talk about this before. The phosgene gas is they're all nasty. Chlorine gas, mustard gas. And mustard gas was called that because it was yellow and there was like a smell of mustard to it. Which it's amazing to me that anybody smelled it and lived to tell the tale, but they did. But phosgene was probably the nastiest of the bunch.
At 5:30 a.m. on the 26th, the Americans went over the top, and at 6 a.m. the French followed suit. This was on a front of over 60 kilometers. Both armies advanced several miles. The Allies had a huge advantage on paper. For example, facing the Americans were 5 divisions at 1/3 strength. So the 9 full U.S. divisions attacking had an 8-to-1 manpower superiority over the Germans.
So it's important to remember that when you're looking at maps and you're talking about divisions. An American division is not the same as a German division at this point. The German divisions are like a brigade. They really are depleted in a significant way.
But, curiously, they had only 821 planes and 189 light tanks. And that was half of the mobile force they had had at the easier San Miguel offensive 2 weeks ago.
And it's important to note, too, when we talk about tanks and planes and artillery and things like that, the Americans, while they brought their own guns for the most part and their own uniforms, most of their equipment was French. They were using a lot of French, like 75 millimeter artillery. They were using French tanks. They were using French planes in a lot of situations.
And that was easier, for this was a major challenge for the Americans. The advance was in a valley littered with streams and bounded to the east by the Meuse. The Meuse heights across the river were great for flanking fire. On the left were the heights of the Argonne forest, and ahead lay the heights of Montfaucon and Romagne.
And Montfaucon's one of the places that I visited. It's a phenomenal site. There's an ancient ruins of a church, which you can actually see here. There's this huge tower that the Americans have put there. One of the American infantry regiments with like 4,000 men attacked and suffered significant casualties. The Germans had 75 machine guns on this hill. 75. But the Americans took it with, I think, a couple of hundred killed, which I'm not trying to downplay that. But if they had 75 machine guns and only killed a couple hundred men, that shows you how depleted and how weakened the Germans were at this point. And it's a significant location. You can see the tower, the Americans, the memorial tower on Montfaucon for like 10, 15 miles away. I mean, this is a really prominent hill that overlooks this valley below.
The Germans had been here since 1914 and were well prepared, to say the least, with all the barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and machine gun posts you could want. And they also had quite an efficient local rail system. They could bring up 6 reserve divisions in just 48 hours. There were 3 defensive systems, with the second and main one being the Kriemhilde-Stellung. All of this protected the Sedan-Metz railway line, for if that fell, the German armies to the north would be isolated.
We've talked before about the importance of logistics in World War I. I mean, logistics are always important in war, and wars have been decided not necessarily always on the battlefield, but by how well you can keep your men fed and supplied. That often affects the outcome. We're hearing about that right now. In Ukraine, we're hearing reports about the Russians not being able to get supplies and food to their troops in some situations. So even in modern times, it's an issue. So these railways are vital because the amount of supplies and food and artillery shells that you have to get to the front are just massive, and they require non-stop rail service, just trains one after the other arriving at the front to be able to supply these armies. You lose that, you lose the war.
Railway line, for if that fell, the German armies to the north would be isolated. Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch had told American Commander John Pershing to take the Kriemhilde-Stellung within 2 days.
Now, Pershing, it's important to note, insisted from the beginning that he did not want the American troops to be under French command. But Ferdinand Foch was, late in the war, named the Supreme Allied Commander, much like Eisenhower was in World War II in Europe. And Pershing, while he wanted to keep Americans under American generals, he did submit to the authority of Foch. And so if Foch said, hey, we need you to attack here, Pershing would do it.
American commander John Pershing to take the Kriemhildestellung within 2 days. While they tried to do that, Henri Gouraud and the French were to push through Champagne toward Rheims. On the 27th, the Americans actually did take Montfaucon, but the Germans had already brought in 4 reserve divisions, and the idea of quickly taking the Kriemhildestellung turned out to be wishful thinking as the week came to an end. Still, the combined advance had taken 23,000 prisoners so far. The other new Western Front attack was a British one. British commander Sir Douglas Haig was now going to hit the German center, the Hindenburg Line. This was going to be a dump.
So the Hindenburg Line, what happens is that before the Germans launched their big offensive, they actually had built a line back, I think, in 1917. And actually the movie 1917 deals with the Hindenburg Line. So they had built a fallback position, like, I don't know, 20 miles or so behind their main lines. And then just seemingly overnight, the whole German army just falls back. And that sets the stage for, if you've seen the movie 1917, where you have Benedict Cumberbatch's character, his unit, attacking because they're like, we've got the Germans on the run, we're attacking. And that wasn't the case. The Germans, it was a strategic withdrawal to make a shorter line, to build a stronger position, and to draw the Allies out. And then it was from the Hindenburg Line that they had counterattacked in the spring of 1918. Well, now the Allies are going to counterattack. And this is kind of the same. This is that Somme battlefield where I just visited and where we just did a bunch of videos. Now they're all fighting over that same land once again.
Double assault, first on the Canal du Nord on the 27th, and then next week on the 29th on the Saint-Quentin Canal. One aspect of the brilliance of that German defense system was that it integrated waterways into it, which had by now become even more significant because they were obstacles against tanks. The Canal du Nord was 30 meters wide and the west bank was 3 or 4 meters high. Past that lay barbed wire belts and machine gun posts. The Germans also held some high ground that overlooked the whole area. The 1st and 3rd British armies would attack, and the Canadian Corps would spearhead this. Now, they didn't have as many tanks or planes as they'd had last month, since these were allocated for the Saint-Quentin attack. But
remember, the Germans have hardly any tanks at all. They only made about 20 of their own tanks. And some of the others that they used were actually captured tanks from the Allies. They never really produced them in any large numbers.
Advanced under a heavy and accurate creeping barrage. According to David Stevenson, the infantry was to cross a dry section of the canal in waves and bring up artillery and machine guns. They made the crossing pretty easily, and engineers began building bridges. In fact, by the evening, they'd made a gap, a break in the Hindenburg Line, nearly 20 kilometers wide and 10 deep. They'd also taken 16,000 prisoners. However, the attack would slow down as next week begins, and though there was 5 days of continual fighting, the attack was called off after heavy Canadian casualties. It was also unable to support the Saint-Quentin attack when that goes off, but that's in the future. The initial Canal du Nord attack had achieved total surprise, but the defenses were unable to be broken without it. It is interesting what different sources say about all this. Canadian Military History Journal contradicts Stevenson and says that Arthur Currie had his Canadians cross in flooded sections except for a narrow dry strip to hit the German flank.
You know, part of history, we talk about this all the time, is considering the source. And what's their agenda? What is their bias? You know, Canadian histories are going to have a Canadian bias. American histories will have an American bias. German histories, German bias, etc. So perfect example of this is the story of the Red Baron, which I covered in my last on-site video from France. You know, Canadians are going to insist that Arthur Roy Brown shot down the Red Baron. That's what Canadian history will tell you. That's how they remember it. That's how Canadians on this channel tend to point it out. Australians will say, no, it was definitely an Australian, Cedric Popkin, an Australian anti-aircraft machine gunner who took him down. It all depends on who you ask.
Here's some interesting numbers for you about all of this action. Now, the British War Cabinet had been worried for weeks that these attacks in the German center would turn into a second Battle of Passchendaele. British Chief of Staff Henry Wilson pointed out to them that during Passchendaele, the British had taken 265,000 casualties and 24,000 prisoners of war. During the month of August 1918, they'd taken just 50,000 casualties and captured 43,000. By crazy comparison, in the week ending September 24th, the British Expeditionary Force took 30,000 prisoners, more than they had in any other week of the war.
Part of this, I mean, there have been large numbers of prisoners taken all throughout the war, especially in the Eastern Front. You see 100,000 prisoners is not an uncommon thing in a campaign. But at this point, remember, this is 4 years in. Germany's been under 4 years of blockade. Not only is the home front dealing with shortages of everything, so are the troops. The troops are tired, they're ill-supplied, they're hungry, and everybody just wants this war to be over. So what I'm going to do now is skip ahead to the next video in this series so that we can pick up the story of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, because that's mainly what I want to focus on right now.
But the German army was not nearly
we're
defeated.
into the next week
and
now.
by the 29th, the Americans had been stopped in the Argonne, partly by the Germans, who had brought in 6 divisions of reinforcements in a couple of days, and partly by total chaos in their own supply and communication lines.
A lot of times when you haven't had a significant advance for a while and suddenly you break through, a lot of times that's what really slows you down is supply. World War II, this happens with Patton. Patton's making huge advances in France, and he has to stop because they have to divert supply for Monty's army up in the north for the Operation Market Garden. And this grinds Patton to a complete stop. Supply is how you move an army.
They had reached the Kriemhilde Stellung, the strongest German defensive line there, but had not yet taken it. And congestion was so bad that when French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau went to recently captured Montfaucon, his path was blocked by American trucks, whose drivers told him they'd been stuck in traffic for 2 solid days. At the end of the week, after reorganizing their supply lines, the Americans attacked Kriemhilde Stellung the 4th. They had a big numerical advantage, but this is a hard place to attack, and they did not reach their targets. The Germans very well knew how strategically important this area was. A World Undone says that OHL...
And by the way, I've said this before, I'll say it again, best book I've ever read on World War I is A World Undone, and he quotes it all the time on this channel. I am working on a website. It's not ready yet, but when it is live, it's going to include a series of books to recommend. In fact, I'll go ahead and put a link in the description to A World Undone if you want to check it out on Amazon.
German High Command considered it the corner pillar of the Western Front, and since it had been reinforced, it would be a tough nut to crack, though they were trying in the face of devastating machine gun fire. And a small advanced American force in the Argonne was cut off and surrounded, but more on them next week.
Lost Battalion.
Anyhow, one nut.
Okay, let's pick up with the next week now.
Autumn rain had come and slowed things, and of course, the German infrastructure was still formidable, particularly in the eastern part of France, where the Americans were attacking. And the Americans had a big problem, a serious shortage of horses. But when American Commander John Pershing asked Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch for 25,000 of them, he was told to get them from the States. But there wasn't shipping space available. Pershing estimated that he was 100,000 horses short.
Jeez.
French General Philippe Pétain suggested solving the supply problems by dissolving the American First Army and having those divisions with supply problems assigned to the French armies. Pershing said no, though interestingly enough, 10 of the 30 American divisions fit for fighting were actually serving under British or French command.
And some of those included like the 93rd Division, I think it was, which was a all-black division, which the Americans said, okay, to the French, okay, you can have these guys. They're, you know, we don't really need them. We don't want them. And even cautioned them not to treat them too well, because then they might come home and expect to be treated well at home. That's a story for another day, though.
This was all kind of unfair anyway. Foch's changing of strategy in September and the speed of setting up the current offensive, one in a rural location, was partly to blame for all this. But the tensions in the Allied command that had ebbed and flowed all year flared up again. Henri Gouraud's French Fourth Army had been making better progress than the Americans in that offensive, and Foch's staff was disappointed with the Americans. And I said last week that French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau got stuck in a traffic jam behind the lines, right? Well, he was furious and told Foch not to try to persuade Pershing of anything, but to order him to do it. David Stevenson points out, the upshot was that the attempt to disorganize the Germans by attacking them from the south had failed, although it had been crucial to Haig's and Foch's conception of the offensive as a whole.
So Haig is the overall British commander. And so if you can just imagine, the British are on the left, up around Belgium, up near the Channel. Then you have the French, and then you have the Americans kind of on the southern end, but not really covering that much ground on their own.
It had done so, moreover, in circumstances that revived old tensions within the Western Alliance. By October 6th, the American offensive had reached casualties of 75,000, and they could not quickly replace their losses any longer. The lousy weather prevented any air support, and the acute horse shortage was really telling. Pershing now decided not to attack the central position, his goal, but would focus on the heights of the Argonne and the Meuse on the flanks. By the end of the week, the Argonne forest was, in fact, cleared of Germans, though it wasn't a big breakthrough. And yet, the Americans had slowly but surely battered their way to the Kriemhilde-Stellung, the main German defense line. Also in the Argonne, on the 8th, an American conscientious objector, well, a former one on religious grounds, saw some action. Corporal Alvin York.
And we're going to tell his story. I visited the site where this fight happened at Hill 223. One of my favorite parts of my trip to France, and I'm excited to bring that story to you in the next couple of weeks.
He and his men were tasked with taking out a German machine gun position. When 9 of his 17 men were wounded or killed, he told the rest to guard the prisoners they'd already taken.
About
he
25.
went after the machine gun post himself. He killed as many as 28 men with insanely good marksmanship, picking them off their machine guns with his rifle, and then foiling a 6-man bayonet charge with his pistol.
And what's crazy about this, and this is one of those things that always happens, why I encourage people to visit historic sites, when you go there, you know, it's one thing to imagine in your mind Alvin York, this one-man wrecking crew, taking on this German machine gun position by himself. It's another to go there and see where the machine gun position was. It was up a steep hill, and York was like 100 feet down. It was really super steep. And, you know, it would have been an incredible feat on flat ground, but to have done it where he did in this position was just amazing stuff.
When the German officer running the post surrendered, York returned to the lines with 132 prisoners and 35 machine guns. He was promptly promoted to sergeant and became not just a national American hero, but an international celebrity.
Now, what's interesting about York's story is that Alvin York's story happens almost at the exact same time that the Lost Battalion, which I'm sure you're going to talk about in a minute. Lost Battalion's like, I don't know, it was like a 10-minute drive from where the Lost Battalion was trapped to where Alvin York got his Medal of Honor. Alvin York earned his Medal of Honor at a place outside of a place called Châtel-Chehery. In fact, I'll show you a map here to show you where we're talking about. This is the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So right down in this area here, you're going to see all these sites we've been talking about. Here's Montfaucon right in the center. And then you're going to see Châtel-Chehery right over here. And it's just south of Châtel-Chehery, I think southwest, is where the Lost Battalion is surrounded and trapped. But just incredible stuff.
That same day, some other men also returned to the American lines. See, last week, an American force of over 500 men holding a ravine about half a mile ahead of the front lines were surrounded by a far larger German force. They were continuously fired upon by artillery for 2 days. Their food ran out. Then they were hit by friendly fire artillery. They sent their last carrier pigeon with the instructions for the Americans to please stop shelling the Americans.
So, Cher Ami is the name of that last carrier pigeon, and Cher Ami's in the Smithsonian American History Museum. You can see Cher Ami. Cher Ami was severely wounded, but made it like the 20 miles or so back to headquarters. And it was the message basically said, "Here's our position. you're shelling your own men. For God's sake, stop it. And we've talked about the story of the Lost Battalion. I won't recount that now. In fact, I'll put a link up at the end if you want to see my video talking about the Lost Battalion.
The Germans sent in flamethrower units. These were dealt with. American High Command thought it was all over for those men and listed them as lost. But the Germans withdrew the 7th, and the Lost Battalion was not, in fact, lost.
And I started to say earlier, but I wanted to wait until he talked a little bit more about the Lost Battalion. The Lost Battalion is one of those stories that was like almost unfolding in real time back in the States. People were hearing about this right away. The Lost Battalion story was an instant celebrity thing. It became the story of the war for Americans, that and Belleau Wood. The story with Alvin York, nobody really knew about it when it happened because everybody was talking about the Lost Battalion. It was only like 6 months later, after the war was over, that a newspaper reporter did an article about Alvin York, and suddenly he became a celebrity like overnight. And it was only then that he got the Medal of Honor. He'd gotten a Distinguished Service Cross, but they upgraded it to the Medal of Honor. He kind of instantly became a celebrity after that story, but it was well after the events had taken place before anybody really knew his story.
The next day, the survivors, 194 of 554, returned to the American lines. And one more piece of American news. On October 10th, the news reported that 20,000 Americans had died in France in the past 2 months of the flu.
Here it comes.
As for the rest of the fighting on the Western Front this week, there was Allied success further west in the center of the front.
So just a couple of closing thoughts. There was more to the Meuse-Argonne offensive than that, but just overall, it's part of a larger thing called the 100 Days Offensive, which was basically the decisive offensive on the Western Front that put an end to the war. And you can see here the numbers. There's about 1.2 million personnel on the Allied side. The vast majority of those are Americans, at least on the Meuse-Argonne part of the offensive. About a third that many Germans. Both sides take significant casualties, about 125 to 150,000 for the Germans and almost 200,000 on the Allied side. 70,000 French, and you can see here about 26,000 killed, 95,000 wounded for the Americans. But Meuse-Argonne is, to this day, the largest and also the bloodiest offensive in military history for the United States. So incredible stuff, and most of the soldiers I've researched over time who were killed in World War I for the Americans were killed in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. A lot of them that first week of October. In fact, I just discovered since I came home from France that I had a cousin who was killed in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, who's buried in the Meuse-Argonne cemetery, which I didn't know about when I was there. So now I've got another reason to go back. But a couple of links I'll throw up for you, some follow-up videos, some things I've talked about concerning this same time period. I'll also put some links in the description. Check all of that stuff out. I'm excited to bring you the first video from the American sector of the war tomorrow. Please click on that and check it out when it goes live. Thanks for watching.